Yeah, we'll just do our best. No stress, no pressure. We're just practicing.
Yeah, and I'm gonna tell my mom. I told her I'd be a bit late to lunch, so if that means 30 fucking minutes, then it's a buffet, so I'll just go get my food and eat it, and then we'll be done.
Sounds good. All right. What is popping, players? Today on No Hard Feelings, Perv and I will be discussing. Oh, I've never called you Perv on this before.
Nice.
That's a new one. Okay, well, it's staying in. Well, Perv and I, or Will and I, whatever you want to call him, are going to be discussing Christianity and religion, a bit in general, but more specifically, very much specifically, Christianity. I'm Parker, by the way.
I'm Will or Perv.
Whatever you prefer. Um, so, just to start out our conversation, there are many common morals that Christians follow, and we're not going to go in depth about all of them, but there are certain ones that have weird little contradictions within them, that I'd love for Perv or Will or Pervy to point out here.
Okay. Dude. All right. Well, I mean, the biggest ones to me, besides any philosophical ones, are the conquest of Canaan, slavery, and then the philosophical ones are kind of this divine hiddenness, which is this idea that God does not make himself apparent to everyone. So you have divine hiddenness, and then you have kind of this argument that we talked about a little bit before this, around free will and the fact that he already knows what's going to happen. So you have a good amount of contradictions in terms of the morality of the Bible, but I think the biggest ones inside of the Bible itself and not kind of like a part of the religion of Christianity are slavery and the conquest of Canaan, as well as some of the ideas of like just there's certain things in the Ten Commandments, like no idol worship, which has issues in Deuteronomy, and there's a few others, but I think the biggest ones that are actually, I don't want to say enjoyable, but like relatively easy to talk about are the conquest of Canaan and slavery. To me, feel like the biggest ones.
Cool. Um, those are definitely some very large and controversial topics. Why don't we start with the conquest of Canaan, um, Joshua's conquest? And so I understand that there were some Hebrews that went out and killed a lot of people in the name of God, and that's about the extent of what I understand. So do you mind, kind of breaking down what exactly was this conquest?
Yeah, so most of the conquests, in fact, all of it, except for like if you want to include a little bit of Exodus, where they're actually just getting into the desert essentially and into the Promised Land, all of it happens in the book of Joshua. Joshua was one of the leaders of the Israelite, clan out of Egypt. So you had like Moses that led everybody out of Egypt, and then Moses died, and Joshua took his place. And so the conquest of Canaan, like, in a broad sense, is so God promised the Jews the Promised Land. Unfortunately, for the people inside of the Promised Land, there was people inside of the Promised Land, and so God commanded the Israelites to go slaughter all of the people of Canaan. And He actually put a specific thing called the ban on these groups of people. And the ban means that you're not allowed to take any plunder from the city. You have to kill all the women, all the children, all the men, all the animals, and you're to burn the city to the ground. Um, and so the most notable stories of this are Jericho and AI, and or it's pronounced I, but it's spelled AI. So but so these are probably the two most notable, other than maybe the day that the sun stops in the sky. But that's kind of a whole other thing that's more of like a scientific claim, and I really don't want to tackle that because that's really complicated. But so for instance, just to kind of tell the stories of them, in Ai, it was a city in the land of Canaan, and it was one of the first large ones that Joshua came and conquered. And the ban really is, at least to me, this is one of those stories that really highlights it, because they came to the city. They said, either accept the fact that you're going to become our servants, our slaves, and work the land, or we will kill you. And I says like, no, we're not going to do that. So we're going to fight. And So the Israelites take their army and they go destroy Ai. And in fact, there's even parts of it where it says that like animals and men and women and children were fleeing the city, and they chased them into the woods, murdered all of them, and then came back and finished everybody else off. And I obviously it feels pretty clear what the moral issues with this are, and I think one of them that we could definitely argue is a moral issue, but we can kind of toss it off to the side because at least to conventional morality it makes sense, which is that the fighting men of like essentially the soldiers of Ai versus the soldiers of the Israelites. Unfortunately, that's how war plays out, and you kind of do have to, if you're not going to take any prisoners, the only option you really have is to kill all of the other fighting force, and because you do have the potential of a revolt. Now, again, I'm not actually saying that that is moral, but I think we can at least kind of wrap that up into conventional ideas of warfare. The real issue comes in, at least for me, with the idea that you're supposed to, not even supposed to, you're commanded to, by God, murder and slaughter all of the women and children. Because one, the women obviously they may have some part in warfare in the sense that they might be making some of the weapons, but they are not a part of the army, and obviously the children are not a part of the army. And I think many of us would at least make the claim that children, at least to a certain point, are innocent entirely. And it's not like it says murder all the children from 13 to 18. It's all the children, which means it doesn't matter if you were born 2 weeks ago, and it doesn't matter if you're a 15-year-old. Now, in that time, a 15-year-old probably would have been a part of the army, but regardless, like if you're murdering children, and I do say murder for a reason, it's murder. Like that, if you're slaughtering the army, that's just different. You're fighting, but the women and children are outside of this, and so it's just kind of a difficult thing to wrap your mind around, the fact that this good, loving, just God, which is one of those are like the key character traits of in this part of the Bible, he's Yahweh, but it's just in the New Testament he becomes like the Lord our God, and in the Old Testament he's Yahweh, because that's like the actual Jewish God. But it's a hard thing to wrap your head around, and the morality of it, at least conventional morality, doesn't make sense that a good, loving, just God would be okay with destroying an entire population of women and children.
Yeah, I think the really funny part about this that we touched on prior to is the idea that anything that God commands is good. And if murdering all these people is good, but murder is obviously wrong according to the Bible, that contradiction is just as illuminated as it can become, especially with the most basic sin, the most basic wrongdoing an individual can do in murdering an individual. So that's a pretty, it's almost a funny contradiction because it's so basic. How can this be present within the text that indicates how you're supposed to live your life? It says, in this chapter to never murder anybody. In this chapter, though, it was okay. That contradiction doesn't quite add up, especially in terms of it being a moral book that is meant to give moral code for the entirety of history. Why is God then able to surpass the morals that he put in place? In fact, I'm sure you know of some specific individuals who are on a certain side of Christianity that would be able to defend this. So, do you mind taking the devil's advocate here?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, just trying to take a few of the different apologetic standpoints. One of them, and this is probably most famously like William Lane Craig, would say just simply because God commanded it, it is good. And because the Canaanites were evil, it was good. And so the claim that they usually make in terms of women and children is that if you kill all the fighting men and you leave the women and children, you're sowing revolt, because some of those children obviously had fathers in the army, and if all the men were killed, even if it wasn't just the fighting men, then obviously all of those children are going to have fathers. And usually, at least historically, if you kill an entire group of fathers and you let the children raise up and become adults, you're usually sowing some kind of revolt. You're going to be dealing with the fact that these kids were still grown up, and this obviously also applies to the women. These people grew up in the customs of this evil kind of heretic society, and so you don't want them to be a part of your society because they could corrupt you from the inside. And so that's one of the like more common ones I hear. And I think the claim that I usually make against that one is kind of another thing that we talked about previously, which is that if God does know everything before it ever happens, then God essentially made those children. And I'm not even going to talk about the women, because I think the women, it's obviously still horrendous to me, but it's a different thing, because if they are adults, they've been raised in this society, they're obviously not going to be okay with anything going on. But the children are, they're innocent. They have no way of knowing anything really, especially the young ones. But that means that God essentially put these children on the planet to die. And some of the claims that can be made is like, some people in Christianity will say that children go to heaven, because they're not, especially if they're not old enough to understand the religion, then they just basically get a free pass. But even to me, that would be like if somebody came into my house and destroyed the place, like absolutely just destroyed everything, and then threw me enough money and maybe even more to take. Actually, yeah, let's say they destroyed $1,000 worth of stuff and they gave me $10,000. Like, yeah, it's great that I can still pay for the stuff that you broke, but I didn't want you to break my stuff in the first place. And the argument I usually hear with that is like, yeah, but it's God's house. And it's like, yeah, but again, that would be like if God forced you to come to his house and then he destroyed all of your stuff that you brought, and then he gave you the money to replace it. And it's like, yeah, but I didn't even want to be here in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it's really just that's the one that I hear relatively frequently, is the fact that since God commanded it, it was good, and because the people were evil, they needed to be destroyed. And because as at least it's consistent with what the text says, so I can give credit to that. Although I still disagree with it. I think it just doesn't make a lot of sense to claim that all of conventional morality gets thrown out the window as soon as God just commands something. And I think that's a very dangerous precedent.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that's what people have issues with Islam right now in the modern society for, is that they do these things under the name of God because God told them to do so, even though no parts of the Quran really support what they're doing. So I think that's just like a kind of a modern day example of what that ends up looking like. And then the other apologetics viewpoint that happens pretty frequently, and it's hard for me to give credit to this one because it's kind of dismissing the text, but it's also, at least it's a better moral claim maybe, is that frankly, it's just a myth. It's a story. It's something to like kind of rah the Israelites. It's just that. It's not something that happened. It's not something that's real. It's essentially, it's a part of the mythos of the Bible. Now, the claim that you can make with that one pretty easily is, or at least it feels like pretty easily, is, again, we know that there are myths and stories in the Bible. That's not anything that anybody is contesting. But if it's this easy to just kind of throw stuff out the window and be like, yeah, but that's not actually real, then it feels like the entire historicity of the Bible, at least the Old Testament, is extremely questionable, which then it makes it hard to even understand what types of morality we're supposed to follow. Because if all of it can just be thrown out the window and kind of decided arbitrarily that, this is actually too bad, so it didn't happen, again, that just sets a extremely dangerous precedent for what you're following if it's inconsistent.
Yeah, so not only is there contradiction, but the contradiction occurs in the most strenuous areas. So then there's no strenuous areas, so it's easy to believe because the things that are actually considered bad within the text aren't actually real, they're just myth. And I think that's really, really interesting to think about because it seems like at that point, almost as if it was made by a human construct. At least because it works out so seamlessly for an individual to believe, as well as the idea that God is knowing all of these things and still allowing them to play out the exact way that they are, right? So if he's meant to be this all-knowing, omnipotent God that has all of this power and knows every single thing, why would he have even created these individuals in the first place just for them to get slaughtered? And then obviously you just answered as to why that would be. And I think the other kind of funny part about it is the fact that if this is meant to be an all-knowing, all-powerful God, he's created, at least in the modern times, a place where, I don't, the majority of the population on the planet aren't actually Christian, which just doesn't make sense. Why would God even create these opposing religions, especially when, your geographical location is the main indicator of what religion it is that you're going to fall into. So, what would these defenders of the Bible say about the really small chance that you're exposed to Christianity in a good light, and the really high probability that you're born into a place that doesn't necessarily support Christianity, where you're not going to be exposed to it in a manner that would actually be capable of turning you into a Christian. Why would this all-powerful God create a setup where you're kind of destined to fail?
Yeah, so to be honest, a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today, it feels like I have heard at least relatively okay apologetic standpoints on. Specifically, slavery has like, I don't think they're good. I don't, or at least I don't want to call them good, but like they have things that track and make relative sense according to what's in the text. This is one that I've almost never heard one that's good. Now, the two that I would hear, I guess, most common, and still it's not usually whenever I ask these questions, it's kind of passed off as like a, well, you know, that's how the world works, which is just a funny way to say that apparently God, or at least it feels like a funny way to say that God doesn't really have control, which kind of goes against everything. But the two that I have heard most often is that one, everyone in the world. Now, this one I have, yeah, and I think you'll immediately see what the issues are. Everyone in the world has access to Jesus just by walking outside and seeing the trees and seeing the grass and seeing the sun. That God is within the creation itself, and that if you cannot find him, that it's you're not looking. Now, the immediate argument I have to that is one, how do you know what you're supposed to look for? For instance, now we've talked about this before. If you grow up in India, the likelihood of you being a Christian is incredibly tiny because nobody else around you is a Christian. So even if you do walk outside and you see the creation that is around and you go, wow, there has to be some sort of overwhelmingly powerful, overwhelmingly loving, gracious, just God. The likelihood that you're going to fall into Christianity is incredibly tiny. You're most likely going to become either Hindu, or if you're extremely rare, even then, you might end up being a Buddhist. And so like the likely exactly what you're saying, the likelihood of you being a Christian is so heavily based on where you were born that if you're born in West Texas, the likelihood of you not being a Christian is incredibly tiny. Whereas if you're born in like Chile, or you're born, Chile is a bad example. I should say like Uganda, um, or like I said, India or Pakistan or Iran. But now Iran is a different one because they actually are becoming, they have a higher growing Christian population. But like in general, these other countries that have kind of like a set religion, for instance, like these countries that have an actual like declared religion of the country, the likelihood of you not being a part of that religion has already made you incredibly unlikely to even manage to be a Christian, or even manage to, like the same way that if Christians hear things about the Quran that are kind of the same as what they are in the Bible, they kind of pass them off as like, well, like it's just a misunderstanding, or like, they just don't believe in the right thing. It's the same thing for them. Whenever somebody who grew up in Islam hears about Christianity, they're going to think the same thing, especially because Islam specifically even claims that like Jesus and things like that were actual people and actual prophets, and that Muhammad was just the last one. And so their religion already has it built in to protect them from falling to other religions. And like you just have you have this difficult, at least to me, this really difficult idea to contend with, because like frankly, if your geography on the planet matters that much onto whether you're going to get to go to heaven or go to eternal suffering in hell, then it doesn't feel like God has made his presence and his his love and his graciousness acceptable to everyone in the same way. Now, you can make the argument that like, well, that's just the world. The world's not fair. Human beings have corrupted the world, and like we are the evil. But again, if God knew all of this was going to happen, then he still allowed all of these people in India, all of these people in Pakistan, all of these people in these other places to essentially never even have a chance.
That's just doesn't quite add up for someone that's supposed to be all powerful. And the suffering that we see from these individuals, or that would occur at least, um, can't be logically it can't be rationally explained, at least. And I know that the comment from the defenders of the Bible would be, obviously God works in mysterious ways, like you previously alluded to. and those funny features that kind of keep the religion intact are so funny that I'll get to in a bit. But I think for now I'd just like to ask, so there's all this suffering within humans and supposed, eternal suffering after passing for the majority of the population of the planet, but other creatures are suffering too. How would the Bible say that the suffering of these other creatures is justified when they aren't in control of whether or not they go to heaven or hell, according to our conception of how that works?
So, again, this is another one that frankly isn't actually brought up very often, the idea of animal suffering. And when it is, most of the people that I hear kind of either passed off as like this, well, for instance, in Genesis, God says that we have domain over the animals. So it's like the animals don't really have free will in the sense that we do. They're kind of just on the planet to help the planet function and to obviously help us survive. And so their suffering is like kind of the way that they're saying is like the suffering just doesn't even really matter because it's essentially a part of the grand plan for us. Now that's an interesting one. I think that's probably the best one. Now, the only thing that I would disagree on is obviously the fact that if you don't believe in Christianity or another religion, then we came from the exact same process that cockroach outside did. We evolved over the course of millions and millions of years. We're animals. We just have highly complex brains. And so whatever, if we do have free will, then the same free will that would apply to us would, at least in concept, apply to them as well. And, kind of what you're talking about with the justification is that, if I fall under a tree and I break my leg and I'm sitting there suffering in the middle of nowhere and I starve to death, at least I get to go, at least I have the opportunity to go to heaven. Whereas the deer, it never does. And so I don't know that the animal suffering one is one that I've actually never really heard contended with well. Now I'd be open to it. I actually just it doesn't get brought up very often. So I would love to hear an actual apologetic viewpoint on it. It's just not one that I actually have heard very often.
I think it's arguable that the comment would just be exactly what you just said, but the way that I'd phrase it is just that through religious perspective, for the Christian perspective, people are, the equivalent to gods on earth. So we're superior beings to these other creatures. They're definitely,
We're his children.
yes, exactly, exactly. As opposed to these other creatures that have, they've experienced like evolution, or they've experienced, they have to actually go out there in the wild and not understand what's going on, what's right and wrong, which is also a different interesting thing to get into there. In fact, I think I'll just do that little bit of transition there. So if these creatures don't know right and wrong, if they're just existing, um, maybe that is the rationale as to why, and the fact that we're God's children would be the rationale as to why that animal suffering is acceptable. But in terms of right and wrong, and in terms of how we've come to be where we are and where we originated from, those stories are a little weird because we have the story of Adam and Eve where they ate the apple, they became aware of what's right and wrong, and then they weren't allowed to be in the Garden of Eden anymore, and um, they were sent out to that one moment has caused all the suffering for the rest of existence. Um, and that's an interesting story, but I know there's more to it, and the fact that God is all knowing and knew that was going to happen, yet still allowed it to be set up, is such a weird predicament to be in. But I'd love for you to go into detail about the two stories that are in Genesis and the clear contradictions that occur, but also the biggest one being God's acceptance to lie.
Yeah. So the two creation stories in Genesis are the first two chapters. So you have the order of events is in Genesis 1, you have water is created first, followed by land, plants, animals, and then humans. And then in Genesis 2, land is created first, followed by water, human, plants, animals, and finally a woman. And I guess the best way I would describe it is that really the Genesis 2 story is much more personal. Like God is walking amongst them. There's this story of of the tree and everything. But the biggest thing to me that sticks out is actually the way that God and then the adversary or the snake or what we know as now as the devil is portrayed, because in the creation story, what happens is that God tells Adam and Eve that there's a tree of life and there's a tree of knowledge. Like, you should not eat from this tree is essentially the basis of it. And it's a glorious, beautiful tree. And, Adam and Eve at this point, they don't know right from wrong. And so so God tells them, if you eat from this tree, the day that you eat from this tree is the day that you shall die. And then the serpent comes along and says, no, like, you're not going to die. If you eat from this tree, you will become like him and you will know right from wrong. And so before I go further, the key points here are, if they have not eaten from this tree, at least from what we know, if the devil's saying the truth, which is obviously kind of a hard claim to make, but then that they don't actually know right from wrong. Now, they know that God told them not to, but if they don't know right from wrong, they couldn't possibly know that disobeying him is wrong. And then again, we also know that God specifically said, if you eat from this tree, the day that you eat from this tree, you shall die. And the serpent says, no, you're not going to die. You will just become like him. Well, so then, Eve eats from the tree and gives it to Adam, and they eat from the tree and they immediately realize they were naked. And so one of the things is that they to understand that they were naked, they gained this self-awareness, which is the idea that they gained the ideas of right and wrong. But the contradiction there for me is, and I've never really heard anybody defend this, because frankly, a lot of these things just aren't talking points in debates or things like that. These are kind of little more personal things that I have. But they didn't die the day that they ate from the tree. Now, technically, the claim that I do hear is that, like, God was kind of being, he was kind of giving an allegory, like, the day that you eat from this is the day you become mortal, and then you will die. Which that's a fine claim. There's nothing I can really say to disagree with that, other than, now, again, this comes down to the fact that we don't even know if translations have remained even kind of accurate. But like, yeah, but like, if God said specifically, the day that you eat of this tree, you shall die, and then the serpent came along and said, no, you're not going to die, you're just going to become like him, then from that, then it appears like God lied to them and the serpent told the truth, which that's obviously a pretty large issue, because if the devil, or at least what we know as the devil, is telling the truth and God is not, then literally what are we supposed to do with that information? Now, again, the claim is always that I have heard is, again, he was kind of being, mystical, and he was saying, like, the day that you eat this, you become mortal and then you will die. But it's like, but if at least if the language in the English text that has been translated is correct, then it appears like God lied to Adam and Eve, which is obviously kind of a large issue, especially because, like you alluded to, or not alluded to, like you said, all of human suffering has come down to that one decision. All of it. Like, God even specifically makes childbirth painful for Eve after this. And so, like, you even have little things like that would have never existed if they didn't eat from this tree. And again, like we've already talked about, if God already knew all of this was going to happen, why did he allow it to transpire? It just seems, it seems like something that is just almost impossible to make sense out of.
Yeah, it's a weird story about, especially because there's two stories. That's also part of the weird part to me, because there's two stories back to back in these back to back chapters, and both of them not putting God in a good light. You wouldn't expect that to be anywhere in the Bible, and yet we're able to find many examples of it. And I think, well, I am curious if the different sections or sects, I think they're called, of religion. So, like, there's, like, Catholicism, and what's actually the word for that?
Denominations.
Denominations, yeah. So I'm curious, do the different denominations have different perspectives on this story, or do they actually? I assume it's just a different interpretation of the same text, which is also just so interesting to think about. Just that in general, it's just our comprehension of the words on the page are different, or at least the story we're telling ourselves about it is different, So we're entirely going to live our lives completely differently, even though we're basing it off of the same text. Funny, but is there a difference in the different denominations and their perspective of the story and their, defense of what has happened?
Most of them follow kind of what I said, especially because, frankly, the Genesis stories are. This is where the difference comes, and I'll talk about it in a second. But like the Genesis stories are kind of usually written off. Like they don't get a lot of attention. Like they get a lot of attention in the fact that like it's our creation story, but they don't get a lot of attention in terms of like these apologetic circles. There's not a lot of like, if I were to say what I just said to a lot of people, it would just kind of get written off as what I was saying, which is like, yeah, man, like you're reading too much into the words of this. Like he was being more mystical and you're taking it too literally. But where the issue comes in is that you actually have specifically one group of people called young earth creationists, which because they believe in the fact that the Bible is the literal and total account of the word of God, their belief is that, and the reason they're called young earth creationists is that they think the earth has only been around for like 10,000 years, which is kind of what the Bible would suggest, at least in a literal sense. So like they believe that the actual story of Adam and Eve happened entirely. Now there's definitely religion or sects of this that like kind of are like, yeah, this is the mythos. Like again, no one could have written this because how could they have unless God like literally told them everything that happened thousands of years ago, especially because we don't know who wrote the majority of the Old Testament. And so that obviously is an interesting one. But young earth creationists take this as a literal account of what happened. Now, most sects of Christianity don't necessarily do that. And so it's an easier thing to kind of pass off as like a mythos.
I see. Um, I think the funniest part here, and I'm I'm just gonna tell you, I'm gonna do a little shift to memetics here. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover?
We could talk about Job a little bit, but
I
besides
was gonna
that, I
say
mean,
I have Job and objectivity, and then we didn't entirely go into slavery, but they're similar things. It's kind of just saying the same thing. It's just like, oh, here's another contradiction. This is how the Christians would say that it's wrong because it's a myth
the
instead of like
slavery one is more interesting, so we could touch on that really quickly if you wanted to. But
yeah, no, I'm down for that. I'm down for that. Okay, so then maybe we have to cut this part out. But
I'm not worried about it.
yeah, I mean, no one's gonna be at this part in anyways. So okay, okay. So how do I even transition from this to that?
I mean, I can just
Yeah,
kind
I
of,
was trying to think of a good way to transition into a question, but that's not easy.
yeah. So I mean, so slavery is obviously a part of the Bible. They have it in,
Because we're just looking around, I'm gonna go pee and mute myself, so you just talk because I'm sure you can talk about this for a good moment.
okay. Um, yeah, so you have slavery, and slavery is obviously kind of a large contention in the Bible. You have it in Numbers, you have it in Exodus, obviously, whenever the Jews are fleeing. But the biggest ones that like are pretty notable are the fact that you have these laws for slavery in Leviticus, and those laws for slavery are they're hard to contend with because of the fact that it actually details how you're supposed to own slaves and how you're supposed to treat slaves. And the issue with it is that, it basically says, and let me see if I can actually find the verse itself. I think it's in Leviticus 25, but you essentially have slavery where you're allowed to beat your slave as long as they get up within a day or two of them being beaten, you're not to be punished for it. And so a lot of times the apologetic argument I hear against what is the laws of slavery is this idea that, well, one, the laws of slavery were different in Israel because of the fact that, you could actually only own a slave for 7 years, and then every 50 years, no matter what, all the slaves would be set free in a Jubilee year. And again, like I just alluded, or like I just said, if you beat your slave too hard and they die, you were to be punished. But the issue with that argument is one, now, it's hard to actually tell in the text, but most of those laws that apply to how you're supposed to own slaves, we think actually apply specifically to Hebrews. And so it's these debt slaves that essentially had a debt and sold themselves into slavery to pay off the debt. And so, yeah, like even then, sure, you get off after 7 years and blah, blah, blah. But if it's not a Hebrew slave, it's not actually clear as to what type of slavery it is. And we think it's basically going to be chattel slavery, which is, lifetime slavery. And the whole thing where you can beat your slave with a rod, and as long as they get up within a day or two, you're not to be punished. Well, that's essentially just saying if you don't immediately kill your slave by beating them, you're not going to be punished. And I don't necessarily think that's a good apologetic moral argument for why this slavery was okay. Now, obviously, the biggest thing with the slavery aspect of it is that if God could, now this is kind of an apologetic argument, is the fact that, slavery existed in this time period. It was essential for how the world functioned during this time period. He couldn't just straight up outlaw it. But like we previously talked about, God outlawed things like lust. He outlawed murder. He outlawed worshiping other gods. Like he very clearly outlawed all of these other things. Why is it that slavery was the one that he had to draw the line at and be like, well, we couldn't do that. And then the other issue with that apologetic argument is pretty clear, which is that if God couldn't make the law a certain way because of the time period, then he's not a timeless God, because God's morality does not follow the morality of the people at the time. The people of the time's morality follows the God. And so, I mean, it feels like a pretty clear one, but there's a lot of references to the laws of slavery if you're interested in it. Most of it happens in Leviticus. I think, like I said, I think it's specifically chapter 25, where it talks about the rules of slavery. And if you really look into it, at least to me and a lot of other biblical theologians, it doesn't seem like it's applicable to everyone. It feels specifically applied to Hebrew debt slaves, which is like, even then, why couldn't God find a better system to pay off debt rather than slavery? And then the last thing that I would throw in about the slavery thing is, it's kind of just a tangent, which is that the Hammurabi's code actually had more lenient ideas on debt slavery than the Old Testament does. And Hammurabi's code is, that's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If you chop your neighbor's hand, he shall chop yours. Like, it's a very, very known, notable code, and even it has more lenient laws on debt slavery. In fact, they could only have a debt slave for 3 years, not 7. And so I think that's an interesting thing to think about, the fact that Hammurabi's code was somehow more lenient towards slaves than the God of the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's just it is really, really funny how that works. And I think the biggest part to me is the lack of the ability for these codes to maintain throughout time, because as you said, the time is meant to adjust to the God, not vice versa. But a lot of this kind of comes down to the idea that if this is an omnipotent God, why are all these things not working out the way they should? With timelessness, with dispersion, with the many number of religions on the planet, with the lack of exposure to Christianity for certain populations, people. And I think another great example is to think about what God did to Job and what he did in terms of taking the things that were important and replacing them with things that on paper are the same, but really aren't. And I'd love for you to just briefly, what happened to Job, and how does this not really make any sense if you're a human being who understands that giving you, you know, replacing your house with a newer, fresher one isn't as gracious of a, depending on the circumstances, of course, but isn't as gracious of an act as it may be on paper.
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, like, the story of Job is one that is genuinely baffling to me. In terms of, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me how, as a Christian, you could read this and see anything other than like malicious intent from God, really, or at least if it's not malicious, incredibly like dismissive of an entire life. Because essentially, for anybody who doesn't know, the story of Job was found in the book of Job in the Old Testament. We don't really know chronologically where it happened. There's kind of two ideas, but that part doesn't really matter. Other than the fact that some people then can write it off as myth because it's not like it's not, but So essentially in Job, the adversary, who in the Old Testament, or sorry, in the New Testament is the devil, but he's not given that name until the New Testament. But the adversary comes and he's like, God, like, look at your faithful servant Job. He's only faithful. Or like, he's like, basically, look at the world, like the world's terrible. And God's like, no, but look at Job. Like, Job is my most faithful servant. Like, he is an incredible, just, righteous man. And the devil essentially goes, or the adversary essentially says, like, well, he's only like that because you've given him everything. You know, he has a nice house, he has animals, he has children, he has a wife, he has money, he has good health. And so God said, and so he says, take all of that away, and will he still be faithful? And God says, yeah, let's figure it out. And so, which is also funny because wouldn't have God already known? But regardless, so God takes away Job's house. He kills all of his animals. He kills his children. He kills his wife. He takes away his good health, and he has boils all around him. And he's literally it describes him scraping at his skin with shards of glass because of how itchy and awful he feels. It is horrible. He even has friends that are like basically accusing him of doing wrongdoing. They're like, if God is treating you this way, you had to have done something wrong. And Job is like, no, like, I swear I have been a faithful servant. And his three friends are like, obviously not, because like, look at what's happening to you. And Job is actively proclaiming, he's like, no, man, like, I swear to you, I have not forsaken God. And throughout this whole thing, Job does not forsake God. He stays loyal. And at the near the end, Job actually has righteous anger, which is one of the things that Christians point to, is the fact that you're actually allowed to be angry at God. And so Job cries out and he's like, God, why have you done this to me? What did I do to deserve this? And God's response is essentially like, well, you wouldn't understand it anyways. And so this is the funniest part though, that we, the reader of the Bible, actually know why, but he didn't get to tell Job himself. And so, at the very end, Job remains faithful. And so God gives him a new house, new animals, new wife, new children, better house, more animals, more children, things like that. But again, or more money. I actually don't think he gives him more children, and because he understands that children cannot be replaced. But the story of Job is just, to me, it truly is one of the most horrendous ones in the Bible. You have this, God says himself, a great righteous man. And for being a great righteous man, he gets punished. And not just him, his children die because Job was righteous and because the devil made a bet with God. And yet this story is kind of portrayed as like this God's love and God's graciousness through hard times and how you just have to remain loyal. But to me, even as a kid, I remember reading through this and being like, but if he wouldn't have even been his servant in the first place, his children wouldn't be dead. So that means that if my dad is a great righteous man, that I'm up for grabs on a bet with the devil. Like that doesn't make
it's very
sense.
human of God to do that. It's very human of God to do that. He's actively taking a bet with the only other individual that he can communicate with on that level, because obviously we are his children, so it's a much different relationship than he has with, we are just meant to take his word as is. The devil doesn't do that, so he's like, oh, I got to prove myself to this guy because he's the only one that doesn't believe, And I think that humanness is
the best part is the devil does believe. In the Bible, the devil believes. He just hates God. He believes totally in his power. He just hates him.
Oh my God, that is funny. Oh my God, that's actually hysterical.
The devil's entire life is just trying to drag other people down with him. He's like, I know everything in this is real. I just don't care. And I want to bring as many people down as I can.
My Lord.
He's a pure hater.
He is. It's easy to be when someone's so much better than everybody else. They, by definition, they're better. God. They're omnipotent, yes. But the human part of it is what really gets me, because it makes you realize that, it doesn't make you realize this, but something to ponder about it is that, so there's all these human characteristics that we see within God, within these stories of contradiction, and they're always written off, right? Why are they written off so easily? Why are these people so, excuse me, inclined to write it off? Why have they kind of almost put themselves into a bit of a delusion to an extent? And that's a silly way of putting it. But why is the Bible set up where these people have to inherently believe without the curiosity to comprehend, like Job? He had the curiosity and is immediately shut down. Why are they not allowed to question and understand? And an important part about that is that idea. If people aren't able to question, then they have to believe without question. And if they're believing without question, then they're going to believe a lot of things. And they're going to do a lot of things. They're going to do anything because then they aren't questioning it. There's no thought to be had. There's no depth to the understanding. It's just strictly, this is what I'm being told, so that is the situation. And what's interesting about it is that's oftentimes the founding of a lot of the modern religions is just founded in.
I'm still listening. I'm just grabbing something.
No, go for it. I'm just thinking. It's founded in belief without question, and if it's founded in belief without question, then that makes the religion almost impenetrable because these people can't actually do anything to change how it is, because the reasoning for its existence is always going to be that it's impenetrable, it's omnipotent, it's the greatest. And that is a consistent factor we see in all these different religions. So why is this showing up? And one of the reasons may be that if perchance these religions were man-made, there's a chance that they went through a similar phase of natural selection, or as you know, modern evolutionary psychologists would put it, would be um, meme selection, but natural selection within them, and memes just being ideas, and that's a really hard thing to kind of wrap your brain around, because isn't a wheel an idea? Isn't my hand an idea? Yes, they are. And I'm not going to go into the depths of defining what a meme is, but religion is also an idea. And if this idea can defend itself by creating the notion that you can't question it, then the idea itself is going to maintain for an extended period of time. And when there's all these features just ingrained into the system of the idea that perpetuate its existence, propagate its spreading, and oftentimes, like we saw with the what's it called, the Joshua's conquest, literally actively taking out the adversaries in terms of belief. These beliefs are just promoting their survival because they're taking down other ideas or other beliefs. Just as in natural selection, one species will take out another, one individual will take out another to keep itself alive, but it'll also do what it can to keep itself alive, whether that be trick itself into thinking it's capable of doing something just so it can try, because it's the only way that a gene can replicate is if it thinks it's capable, the vessel can think it's capable of. I'm realizing I'm being really abstract right now, so I don't know if this is actually capable of being followed by. I just know
If you
that
want, I can actually just throw in the actual natural selection of the biblical canon.
Oh, go for it.
So in after Jesus' death, you had the Gospels that were written in general. We think about 3 to 7 decades after Jesus' death. The first mention we have of Jesus is about 4 decades after. It was a historian named Josephus. He mentions the fact that other people saw Jesus. He didn't actually see him himself. But after Jesus' death, you had this period of time where Christianity was blowing up. And so you had lots of different versions of Christianity, and you have lots of different books that never made it into the Bible. Like, for instance, you have the Gospel of, you have a couple of Gospels that never got put into the Bible. And the way that that worked is you had all these different sects of Christianity. For instance, the one that we talked about in our first podcast with Jordan Peterson of Gnosticism, which essentially believes in the idea of it, but not the actual literal historical thing that happened. And so, but you had in about 300, whenever the Romans became a Christian empire, someone finally decided, they were like, okay, we need to make this canon. Like, we need to make a biblical canon. And the way that they did it is they gathered up a bunch of books and they put them together. But then all of these other versions of it got destroyed. Like they burned texts, they
Hmm.
silenced groups of Christians. Like they did a whole cleansing process essentially. And even since then, there's been a more of a cleansing process because you have Catholicism, which has more books than someone like an Episcopal, like an entirety of more books than an Episcopal does. And so, but like these groups like Gnostics, we didn't actually really know about them until a couple hundred years after, where we started finding these texts that were buried to protect them from being burned. And so, like, even in Christianity, you have had this process of cleansing and the idea forming and being reshaped and being like have being narrowed down into one thing. Whenever the original New Testament, I think the original biblical canon of the New Testament had 20, I can't remember this exactly, so don't nobody quote me on this, but it was kind of like, I think it was basically 27 books, and the New Testament now has amount of books is, I'm looking this up. Yeah, so the New Testament has 27 books now, but the original biblical canon did not. Like there was gospels that didn't get included, and um I wish that I would have had more time to prepare for this because I can't remember some of it. But um there's multiple forgotten gospels. There's lost gospels in like the Gnostic writings. Like again, like I said, Catholicism is the easiest one. You literally have the Apocrypha, which has no other Christian denomination has the Apocrypha in it. And then even the Catholics, they pray to saints, and other Christians, according to what the 10 Commandments say, that's heresy. You're essentially praying to something that's not our God. And so even Christianity has this like actual trackable, idea of memetics where it's been slowly, transformed into this narrow idea of beliefs. And it happened, guess what? As soon as the reigning empire of Rome, which technically turned into the Byzantine Empire because blah, blah,
Hmm.
blah, whatever. But it turned into a Christian nation. And so the nation was like, okay, well, if we're gonna be Christian, we're gonna be one type of Christian,
Mhm.
which is like, it's so funny to think about that before, like even 300 years after Jesus's death, that's finally when the actual biblical canon was formed. It wasn't even formed when Jesus was alive, or even 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years after. People were still arguing about this for 300 years until it became a one biblical canon. And guess what? We're still arguing about it today. And it's been 2,000 years. In 2,000 years, how much do you think this religion has changed that we can't even fathom?
Mhm.
Like,
And there's so many different denominations today that have just slowly formed out of, the remnants of the initial Catholicism. That's I believe that. I mean, that's what the Romans were, correct?
Catholics?
Isn't that the same thing?
Yeah, yeah. They
Oh,
were, I mean,
okay.
that's where Roman Catholics came from.
Yeah, I presumed. No, it's absolutely hysterical to think about that because it took us 300 years to get to the point where we had what's considered like the real truth about the Bible, or however you want to put that. And then since then, we've had all these other real truths, all these other ideas, right? These ideas around the same thing, and those different ideas maintain themselves. But if you get something all powerful like a Roman Empire, then it's going to make sure we're only doing one idea. So that's something else that's really interesting, because if you can get your idea into the eyes, into the mind of those who are most powerful, then that idea can spread really fast. And it can spread in a really effective manner where it takes out other ideas. Um, so I don't know if there's necessarily a point to this conversation. We're not trying to make people more or less Christian. We're just trying to point out some really interesting contradictions within the Bible, as well as pointing out some themes that we see in evolutionary psychology that also apply to religion, as religion is an idea that's existed for, I mean, I mean, religion and spirituality have pretty much existed for all of recorded history. So it's pretty interesting to
If you go back to the Old Testament, it literally goes back 5 to 6,000 years that this has been around.
mhm.
And for the first thousands of years, it wasn't written down. Or at least, okay, I shouldn't say that. We don't know if it was written down because we haven't found any texts. But
Yeah,
like that's pretty remarkable.
it
Like
is.
even regardless of any religious thing, the fact that this idea has lasted that long
It's a
is
powerful idea.
it's ridiculous. I mean, and like you said, we're not trying to make anybody more or less religious. In fact, like I've said this multiple times, maybe not on on the podcast, but like the basic ideas of Christianity are great ideas. The idea that we should love each other, the idea that we should be a part of something greater than ourselves, the idea that we should care about what the world looks like and about the things that we are doing, and we should care about morality. All of these are fantastic ideas. It's just the fact that Christianity is such a large, prominent thing
Mhm.
that it's interesting to go through and figure out what about Christianity doesn't, at least to non-Christians, what about it doesn't track very well.
Yeah, and while the communities that Christianity can create are fabulous, there's also things that it can create that aren't so great if you look back on it from today's perspective.
Well, and
So
even the idea that we were just talking about how the ideas transform, the Bible doesn't say, like, this is kind of a weird one, and I know people talk about this all the time. The Bible literally doesn't say a single thing about gay people. Not a single thing. Yet the Bible is so actively used in politics to say that it's not okay. And even the verse that they use to refer to it, it's let me actually pull up the verse so I don't misquote it. It's man shall not sleep. Like it's often quoted as like okay, so it's Leviticus 18. It says, "Do not have sexual relationships with a man as one does with a woman, that is detestable." What that verse actually says in translation is a man shall not have sexual relationships with a boy as he does as a woman. It's talking about pedophilia. And even better, even if you track that context of the verses before it are talking about incest. So it's not even mentioning the fact that it's like man and man. It's not talking about it at all, other than in a specific sense of you could either talk about it as pedophilia or you could talk about it as incest. It has nothing to do with being gay. Nothing. But the idea has slowly become, especially because the Romans, which I know people talk about this all the time, but like, how much do we hear about Roman bathhouses, man? Like, like come on. It's just the idea of the medics part of this is really funny.
because once the idea gets into the mind of the individual, it can change in that mind, and then that change can implement changes into others' minds. So these days, ideas are just capable. I mean, we could talk about this for another like 30 minutes. So I think honestly, for now, we'll just end it with these ideas have changed a lot. Christianity has changed a lot in general, and there's a lot of ambiguity in there. There's a lot of weird things that weren't written down. So do
I would
what you
urge,
will with that information. It's really cool. It's really interesting, especially
yeah.
considering it's still here today and as prominent as it is. Really
I mean,
fascinating.
it's actually it's a direct window into our past. Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
and then
Absolutely.
anybody who's interested in it, I would urge you look up the lost gospels. Like, there's supposed to be a gospel of Mary Magdalene. That's not in the Bible.
Mm.
Like I said, the Apocrypha. Any Christian who's not a part of the Catholic Church has probably never even read the Apocrypha. Like, there's lots about this religion that even inside of the religion is unknown, and that it's in itself is ridiculously interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Like that idea alone, we could probably have an entire podcast about.
Yeah, probably 3.
Yeah.
Well, I think we'll end it there. I hope that a single person listened to this part, which absolutely did not happen.
Nope.
But you'll know that Perv is a little weakling because you got to this point. So good for you. I love that symbol, dude. It's such a
It's
good one.
great.
God, it's so elite.
You know what's really sad is if you
I'm gonna
ask
end the recording,
kids,
by the way.
yeah, if you ask kids now to like make a phone,